from the Department of Natural Resources in Palmer.
Is that too dark for you? Is there another light I get up? There's got so many lights.
Okay, thanks, Danielle. My name is Heather Stewart. I work for DNR in the Division of Agriculture as the Invasive Weeds and Agricultural Pest Coordinator. So a lot of what I do is statewide projects coordinating with local efforts and also working with federal partners and other agencies about dealing with invasives in general. So with that, I'd like to start my presentation. So what I'll be talking about today, here's a little bit of an overview. Here's an introduction to Elodea. I'll give you a very basic biology lesson. How many here have heard of Elodea before? Everybody, pretty much? Okay, great, because that'll make this part pretty easy with basically giving you just a quick introduction of what makes this plant invasive and a threat to Alaska, but it sounds like you all are pretty well educated on the issue, so that's great. And then I'll slide into Elodea in Alaska, sort of the discovery dates, the distribution, and I'll show you some maps on so far what's been surveyed and where it's been found. And then I'll jump right into state involvement, what I've been doing, what the state's been doing with sort of these collaborative efforts, how we formalize those collaborative efforts, who's kind of taking the lead. And then I'll kind of give a little bit more of a regulatory approach of what we've been doing and kind of the direction that we want to take this. I'll also talk briefly about the statewide Elodea management plan. This is a drafted plan that we're working on right now with a lot of people in this room right now. And then sort of the next steps for the state in general. So Elodea is considered Alaska's first freshwater submersed aquatic invasive plant. What does that mean particularly? Well, it's submersed, so it grows below the water surface. It's invasive, and based on the executive order, invasive basically just means that it's non-native to the ecosystem that you're talking about, and that the introduction is actually going to cause some type of economic, environmental, or human health harm. So that's basically how we're classifying Elodea, because it has the potential and can do these harmful things. In Alaska, particularly, we're talking about Elodea natalia, Elodea canadensis, and some of these are hybridized also, because it's been in the aquarium trade for so long. It's very difficult to kind of differentiate between natalia and canadensis. So these are native to temperate North America and the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Valley. Elodea natalia is actually considered invasive in Europe. I'll show you a good picture of an example of that. It's actually been responsible too for some local extinctions of some native vegetation in Norway. So again, that sort of environmental harm plays a role in Elodea's basically characteristics. And even though it's native in some parts of Canada, it's actually considered a problematic native species because it reduces being able to navigate in these waterways. So if we look at sort of a distribution based on USDA maps, you can see Elodea canadensis is classified as introduced. Elodea natalia is not native, and again, it's also introduced, but they haven't quite figured that out yet. But it's grown deliberately as an aquarium plant. That's why it was what we think introduced into the state originally. The nasty thing about Elodea is that it spreads vegetatively through fragmentation. So when it is broken up and basically is able to propagate into a new infestation if that piece of plant is carried to a different location. So that's more or less how it can spread, both intentionally and unintentionally. It's most likely introduced to Alaskan waters because of the aquarium trade. I'll talk a little bit more how that has changed since, and it's mostly unintentionally spread by recreational equipment, boats, gear, float planes that are contaminated and basically go from one site to another site because of that fragmentation process. Here is an example of where it's become pretty much an environmental and human health hazard. This is a sort of the poster picture of Elodea when we describe how harmful it can be. This is in the United Kingdom. They are basically using a weed harvester now to cut pathways for boats. They're not doing any sort of major control at that point in that system. They're basically just making sure people can travel through the waterway with their boat by cutting it down like a lawnmower. And that's kind of another issue because of the fragmentation process. It actually helps accelerate some of the growth of Elodea once it's cut. And then down here on the right-hand side is a picture of it in, I believe, the Chena Slough, which is in Fairbanks. And this picture is actually pretty similar to some of the infestations in Anchorage. But if we were to look at the difference between Chena Slough from 2001 to 2011, you can see a significant change in the substrate basically because of that vegetative growth. Again, it's a submersed aquatic weed, so it grows below the water column. On the left, you can see a fish there. On the right-hand side, no fish. And there is some recent work that Trish Works is doing with the grayling fisheries and the impact that it's had in the Chena Slough with some of the fish that are resident there. So you can see here that there's a significant difference from just 2001 to 2011 on what Elodea can do and how harmful it can be to these ecosystems. So then I'm going to show you a little bit more about where it's at in Alaska and sort of the history of it being found in Alaska. The first time that it was documented, actually that's supposed to say, in 1982 instead of 2010. There we go. Thank you. I figured it out. In 1982, it was first documented by as a UAF herbarium specimen in Eak Lake. And since then, it was found in 2010 in the Chena Slough and the Chena Lake by the U.S. Forest Service, Trish and Nick here in 2010. And so that kind of opened up people's eyes to, oh, I guess, this species hasn't been found, up until this point is pretty interesting. So people started to look elsewhere, including some U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Anchorage. And in 2011, they found it in Long Lake, Little Campbell Lake, and Sand Lake. And they did a few other roadside surveys of some other water bodies, but those were the 3 lakes that they had found it in. That was another sort of alarming thing to find it in Anchorage, especially Sand Lake, because of float plane traffic actually traveling to and from Sand Lake to elsewhere in the state, and the proximity of Sand Lake to Lake Hood being less than 2 miles due south. So for a float plane lake, that's one of the most highly trafficked float plane lakes, being close to an Elodea infestation was pretty alarming. So more people started to do some surveys, including, so the blue is basically areas where it was surveyed and not found. The red is areas where it has been found. So in 2012, there was a number of different surveys done by local groups and efforts in the Matthew Valley, and it wasn't found, thankfully. But they also were kind of limiting their surveys to easily accessible areas, roadsides, and things like that. There was a significant push in Fairbanks for more surveys. They continued to find it nowhere else except for a little bit further down in the slough and the Chino River. But for the most part, those were the only three areas that they found it in. They did find it in the Kenai and Stormy Lake and Daniels Lake, and John Morton will talk a little bit more about that case study. But also in Cordova, there was a lot more surveys done, sort of more or less because they were out and about doing other surveys for bird nesting areas and things like that. And Kate will be here to talk after me to give a little bit more of the specifics of that. But when those surveys were done, they actually found it in more than just Eyak Lake, in McKinley Lake, Eyak River, Wrongway Pond, Martin Lake, and the Allegheny Slough. So this is just a few years ago of all of these new infestations that we found around the state. In 2013, the Kenai did a very extensive survey of a good portion of the peninsula. They found it in one other spot in Beck Lake. There was a number of other different surveys in the Matsu Valley that didn't find any. And so it continued to be relatively undetected except for the known areas. Except for in 2014, there was one survey that was not necessarily a survey in the sense specifically for Elodea, but somebody who was familiar with the species from Fish and Game was working on a project for pike suppression, knew what it looked like, and had actually found it in a remote area where it's only boat and float plane accessible in Alexander Lake. And through some communication with where it was found, it's actually a relatively isolated infestation within the lake system, so that's good. We know it hasn't been there for very long. And we actually suspect it from coming from Sand Lake because the landowner of the cabin in Alexander Lake, where the infestation just happens to be right in front, also lives on Sand Lake. So we know that's a huge vector with float planes. And because of that too, we also found it in quite a few other areas, including Bering Lake, some of the ponds off of the Eyak River, and some more sloughs off of the Allegheny Slough. So this is the most up-to-date information that we have of where it's distributed in the entire state so far. We also, the good thing about this too is we also know where it's not found as well. But when you think about how many different water bodies haven't been surveyed, particularly in the Cordova area, all the rest of the blue are additional water bodies. In the state, there's been 270 water bodies total surveyed. 19 water bodies with Elodea in it, and then 9 of those actually are within the Cordova area. So it's really pertinent that we're here today bringing up this information because of how important Cordova is with regards to basically the goals that we have as the state. So I'd like to ask my question, how is DNR responding to this issue? Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of what we're doing. Back up. Yeah. So what has DNR done so far with this issue? In January of 2013, we signed a memorandum of understanding with both the DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, and Fish and Game. And basically what this MOU states is that it recognizes DNR as the lead in dealing with Elodea, particularly freshwater aquatic invasive plants, and that we would work collaboratively on dealing with this issue. Even though DNR is going to take the lead, we'd still be able to work it through the state interagency-wise to deal with this. We'll also analyze finalize some existing management methods for Alaska and prioritize some critical areas. We also want to have some efficient permitting processes to use these control methods that are effective. With this need for statewide Elodea eradication. And that's really our goal here, is to eradicate Elodea now that we know and have a better concept of where it's at and distributed within the state. We also want to expand the public outreach and education. That's why I'm able to come here and talk to you guys about these issues, because I really want us to work forth as a service to the public. That's basically what I'm here for, is to be able to be utilized and do what I can for you guys to make something happen. The MOU also states that there's a statewide plan and coordination that needs to happen, and that it needs to incorporate this interagency response. Even though that it says interagency for the fishing game DEC, we've actually expanded this a little bit more to incorporate some of our federal partners and local partners as well. And we also want to implement a plan for eradication, and that's really the goal here, is statewide eradication of Elodea, which I think is definitely feasible. Finally, we want to initiate efforts to eliminate further introduction and spread of Elodea to the state. How do we do that? Well, we might not have a list of any aquatic species on our regulatory list. That list is mostly basically agricultural and terrestrial plants, but that's also because that list was made right when statehood was made, and so that list hasn't been very lucrative through the needs of Alaska. But we can change the list eventually. It is a little bit of a timely process, and at the moment it's not necessarily a priority of the current legislation. That's sometimes how the state works, but we can do other things, like put an emergency quarantine in effect for certain species, and so that's what we've done. And we really want to basically fulfill the MOU. We wrote it for a reason, so we can actually implement those things. And the emergency quarantine was one of the best ways that we can immediately stop basically importation of Elodea into the state. And we also included a few other species that could basically be potentially invasive in Alaska also, including Egeria hydrilla and the Eurasian water milfoil. Those are kind of the top 3 aquatic invasive plants that other people have dealt with in the lower 48 that are also in the aquarium trade. And Lars might be talking a little bit more about those species and specific case studies for those. But we wanted to basically not just stop with Elodea, but make sure that the rest of our waters were being protected from these other potentially harmful species in Alaska. We also didn't want to necessarily deter educational opportunities for using Elodea. Like back here, we have a tank full of it right now. We wanted to bring some in to show you guys what it looked like. And so there is a permitting exemption form that you can fill out because this species is also used pretty widely in schools. But we do want to emphasize too that the permit or the exemption form actually makes you promise that you're going to get rid of it appropriately. But the goal basically was with this quarantine to stop the known vectors of intentional spread and to prevent new infestations from actually going into some of these other natural systems within the state. The next step of what we're doing with the state, in my perspective, is that we're making a statewide Elodea management plan, and eradication is the goal here. And with eradication being the goal, we felt it being important that we bring other people to the table. And so some of our partners include myself, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, U.S. Forest Service, Anchorage Park Foundation, Homer Soil and Water Conservation District, Fairbanks Soil and Water Conservation District, Copper River Watershed Project. Am I missing anybody? There's a lot of you guys in the room here too, which is great. But basically including all of these people, so this document can actually be utilized, and it's not just another DNR state document getting put out there and nobody utilizing it. We want to bring everybody to the table so we can use this document appropriately. And so some of the components that we have in the management plan is basically the need for action, some integrated management methods, the ones particularly with emphasis on the most effective ones, permitting requirements, what you need to do to take those steps within the state system to be able to do that work, continued monitoring efforts, local efforts. We are going to mention kind of each of these known infestations and the history of that, how they've been managed to date. And then again, the most important part is the implementation section of this document. And this is still in a draft form. We're actually going to be sitting down with the majority of the people, with the partners included tomorrow, to really kind of figure out how we can use this as a living document. So then what's next for the state? Fairbanks was actually the first to test manual removal of Elodea biomass between 2013, it might even be 2012 to 2014. They did find it very labor-intensive, time-consuming, and largely ineffective, and that the collection of fragments downstream after rigging methods were considered a major challenge. Again, that fragmentation process also is a little bit difficult, but basically their goal was trying to reduce the biomass. So because of those challenges and those ineffectiveness, they're actually talking with some CPRO Corporation representatives to actually evaluate some herbicidal methods for control and ultimately eradication. Again, this goal with eradication is very important here. And then the Kenai is actually the first to use an herbicide treatment very successfully, and John Morton is here with the Kenai Wildlife Refuge. He's going to be talking more about that here in a little bit. And kind of here's some new information that I'm not even sure if everybody knows about, but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is actually funding the Anchorage work to treat those infestations also with an effective herbicide this year up until 2017 for those 3 Anchorage lakes, including Sand Lake, the one with the floatplains on it. And then in addition to that, there's also some Mat-Su Fish Habitat Partnership funding for a 2015 treatment for Alexander Lake, the one lake found in the Mat-Su, which is wonderful news because we are reaching this goal of eradication based on these management decisions that we're using effective means of getting rid of Elodea. So then what's next for Cordova? Well, that's kind of why you guys are here today. That's why we're all sitting at the table and discussing these issues. And so I encourage you guys to ask a lot of questions during these next few speakers. And yeah, know that we're here in support for being able to answer those questions and help you guys understand that eradication is the goal here. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Danielle.
Thanks, Heather.
Thanks again. We have a few questions already.
Yeah, where did it start in the state, Europe, or elsewhere? Yak Lake, or elsewhere?
Yeah, well, the first recorded known Elodea was found in Yak Lake
Okay.
by that herbarium record. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Did you have any?
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I'm wondering, so you mentioned if you were to have some Elodea in an aquarium, and you might have a permit for it, you're asking people to dispose of it properly.
Yes.
Could you describe what disposing of Elodea properly might entail?
Double bagging it and throwing it in the trash is the most effective and cheapest way for most people to dispose of it properly. It's about 80% water content, and so there's also this, you can dry it out. Some people have said, can I compost it? It composts okay, but because of the water content, that can kind of mess a little compost. So double bagging and throwing it away is the most effective way. That way we know it's going from your garbage can to the dump.
What about the water, in the aquarium, or it goes down the drain?
You can drain the water out as long as you make sure that there's 0 fragments in the water.
No, okay.
You use a screen.
Yeah.
So you mentioned about the new plan and, how this plan is being reclassified, or at least going to be reclassified, for control. What about airplanes going from lake to lake now? Is there some issue going to be happening with that as far as control? I mean, it's difficult once you take off.
And that's part of the outreach component. Myself and a few other DNR folks have given talks to floatplane pilots at conventions or meetings and things like that for making sure that that is preventable. We also have these maps available on our website, so if people want to basically plan a trip and want to stay away from those lakes, that they can. As far as other information, that's up to the discretion too of being a responsible pilot and understanding where you should be taxiing through, where your awareness is of Elodea to be able to prevent that from happening.
Well, kind of a follow-up then too, if you're going to start a treatment program and you're going to treat one lake, it seems that you're going to have to go to all the lakes in the area that are known concentration areas and treat them all at the same time.
Yep.
Or you're just going to reinfect.
And that's what we're trying to do with Anchorage and the Matsu at the same time. Since we basically know where the Alexander infestation came from, we want to prevent that from happening again. So we're going to be basically implementing management in both the Matsu and Anchorage at the same time.
So then one more question
Yeah.
is with your treatments, since you're going to be using a herbicide, how is that going to affect the other plants within the system, the native plants?
Okay, that's a good question, and that actually will be addressed a little bit later on
Okay.
with Lars and Andrew here too. So, and I'm sure John will be able to testify for some of that too, for what they're doing down in the Kenai. I didn't try to divert that too much, but it will be addressed. Any other questions? Okay, great, thanks.
Next up is Kate Mohat. She's an ecologist with the Forest Service in Girdwood, and she's going to talk about the surveys that the Forest Service did on the Delta.
Okay, so Heather went over an excellent big picture of where Elodea is in the state. She talked a bit about where it is in Cordova. So I'm going to be pretty brief here. We've got some awesome presenters here. So I'm just going to get into just a few of the specifics of the surveys that we did this past summer in the Cordova area and what we have planned for next summer. So, as you've heard already, Elodea was first documented in the state of Alaska in Eyak Lake. This is an actual picture of the herbarium specimen that was collected. And what's interesting about this is there was transects done throughout the lake, and plants were collected at various locations. Only one location had Elodea, and that was by Mavis Lake. It's thought that it was introduced from an aquarium dump. So fast forward to 2011, there's some Joyce on left there. China slough infestation kind of sent red flags up around the state. People started calling Cordova saying, hey, is Elodea still in Eyak? And geez, we haven't really noticed it. Let's go out and see if we can't find it. And sure enough, we found floating fragments visible across the lake. We found rooted infestations of it. It was pretty patchy here and there. And so we saw a lot of floating fragments around the footprints, so that naturally took us to our next step, and that is to go survey areas that get a lot of floodplain traffic or boat traffic.